Alright guys, welcome to the part 2 of the Micropolygon Displacement tutorial for the Space VFX Elements free update. In the previous part of this tutorial we explored the basics of the Micropolygon Displacement and talked about the 4 awesome ways to take your space art to the next level using this technique. Alright guys, Gleb Alexandrov here, and we have 5 more displacement tips to go. In this tutorial we're gonna be taking a look at how you can bake a depth map, and also how to tweak this depth map in 3D, then rebake it and make it seamless. The next stop will be this doodle art displacement technique inspired by Michaelis. And of course we'll just have to experiment with this Prometheus looking displacement effect. Ooh, that's really creepy. And then we'll talk about animated displacement using the procedural noises. That really looks like a droplet floating in space. Alright space travelers, let's get started by baking depth maps. So what we have here is just a plane, nothing special. And I'm gonna create a camera. I'm pressing the G key and then the Z key to move it upwards. Hit N to open the right tool shelf, and I'm gonna set the rotation, X, Y, and Z rotation to 0. That will make the camera point downwards. And that's precisely what we need. Let's press Ctrl 0 on the numpad to make this camera an active camera. Now I'm going to come over to the camera settings, or rather to the object settings first, because I love renaming stuff. Let's call it camera_depth. Now let's open the render settings tab and set the resolution to square something, like 2048 by 2048 pixels, 100%. Okay, let's now switch to the camera tab and select orthographic instead of the perspective. That means that we no longer have the perspective distortion, and now we just have to adjust the orthographic scale to basically encompass this plane. What I'm also going to do is move the camera slightly out of the view by pressing G. Now let's start the ball rolling and create some geometry. Because obviously to render depth we need some kind of geometry. So I created this cube. Now we can do whatever we like with it. For example, enter the edit mode by pressing tab and scale it like this. You can press N to open the right tool shelf and enable the ambient occlusion. That will allow us to see the contact shadows and the intersection between objects far more clearly. Now I'll just fast forward through these doodles. Nothing interesting here, just a bunch of cubes. I'll scale it up, scale it down, move it around like Lego bricks. What I'm doing here is I'm just creating a variation in depth or in height, depending on your point of view. All of this to demonstrate the depth baking process and the displacement process afterwards. Now I'm going to grab the camera and move it like this, for no particular reason. It looks well organized and cool this way. And now let's jump into the rendered viewport mode. Select some object, go to the materials tab, and click on new. Let's call it, I don't know, depth. I hate being original. 21st century is really a century of compilation, stealing, repeating stuff. Okay, now I'm selecting every other object, and then I'm holding shift and selecting the initial object with this new material. And I'm clicking on this icon and selecting copy material to others. Basically, this little trick does exactly what you might expect. It just copies this depth material to all other objects. Now let's open the node editor, delete this diffuse shader by pressing X. Next I'm gonna press Shift A, select shader, emission shader. For the non-photorealistic effects like the depth rendering, emission shader obviously works best. Now I'm pressing Shift A, selecting input, camera data, and I'm dropping in here because why not? Now I'm dragging the Z depth output into the strength socket. Now watch this. To squeeze the Z depth range to something manageable, I'm gonna implement the math node. Insert it between these nodes and switch to the subtract mode like this. Now you can just hold shift and click and drag this value until you see something that looks like this. Now we see that something's going on with the depth, but still, the colors look like they're inverted. Because now black represents the highest point. What we need to do to fix that is add the color invert node. For the depth maps and for the displacement, we usually expect that the points that are closer to the camera, they are just brighter. Okay, and as a last step, I'm tweaking the value of the subtract node. What I'm trying to do here is create a gradient from the middle gray point all the way up to the light gray. And it still surprises me that in one of the Space VFX tutorials I mentioned 50 shades of gray, and you went crazy because you love this movie, I know. Okay, let's jump over to the render tab and select OpenEXR format. This is a 32 bits format. You can also select GPU compute, but it doesn't matter at all because it renders very fast. And now I'll just hit render. Doo-doom. Let's save the depth map. And why 32 bits EXR? Because it's so much better when it comes to displacement. No jagged edges and shenanigans like this. 32 bits can hold a lot of information. Alright, fantastic. Point number 6, Sculpting Doodle Art with displacement. Once again, it's preferable to have 32-bit EXR or HDR file because it really helps to avoid the issues related to low-quality images and displacement. So we have a plane here. Let's hit U and unwrap it. After that, in the node editor, I'm adding the new texture. Image, texture, hit open, navigate to the folder with the textures, and let's select this displacement map that we have baked. I'm going to turn on the texture preview to see what we are doing here. And we have this grayscale map, and we unwrapped the plane, okay. Now we go to the rendered viewport mode, and let's hook this image texture up to the displacement socket. Then, as usual, press tab twice in the viewport to refresh the displacement. And if you want the displacement to be much stronger, let's add the math node and set it to multiply and multiply it by something like 2, for example. Or maybe even higher, let's try 5. Hit tab twice, and that looks pretty good to me. And if you compare this technique, this displacement technique, to sculpting or to polymodeling, it has its own advantages. If you go to the edit mode, and then just select this UV island and move it around, obviously the texture updates and the displacement updates as well. So you can kind of generate the geometry on the fly and experiment with the shapes and forms, and that's a really artistic, really fluent process. That's why I love it so much, especially when it comes to sci-fi-ish stuff. Imagine this quick process of generating sci-fi panels and stuff. So let's jump over to this scene. And by the way, to create this torus, let's hit Ctrl-Alt-U to open Blender User Preferences, go to Add-ons, Add Mesh, and activate this Extra Objects add-on. Now we can just press Shift-A, go to Mesh, Torus Objects, and select this torus knot thing. I find this object to be very appropriate for testing different stuff. Its curves are so attractive. And I also set up these 3 light sources, nothing special, the key light, the fill light, and the rim light. Just plain 3-point lighting. And what I'm gonna do now is swap my boring displacement map with this one by Michaelis. It's much more elaborate, I just drool over it. If we go to the modifiers tab now, you'll notice that we have subdivision source modifier with adaptive checkbox enabled. Now let's hit tab to enter the edit mode. Let's select all polygons by hitting A, then hit U and press reset. That will reset the UV map, and now we can start playing with it. Let's hit U again and select, for example, Smart UV Project. Hit OK. That's obviously the wrong way to do it because, you see, UV islands are a bit curvy and don't quite align with our image. That means that if we go to the material of this torus and add the image texture, hook it up to the displacement, just to test it, and select this displacement low.exr, hit tab twice, and it turns out complete garbage. Because it doesn't follow the contours of the geometry, and this technique becomes completely useless. So let's first add the multiply node, set the value to 5 to just make the displacement stronger. Now you can start doodling with UV maps and the texture. Let's set the viewport to texture mode. Reset once again all UV maps by clicking U and reset. Now just selecting all polygons, then shift and select this polygon. And after doing this, I'm just hitting U once again and selecting follow active quads. Okay, and this make the continuous strip of polygons for the UV island. That's perfect. That's exactly what we need. I'm scaling it down in the UV image editor by pressing S and dragging the mouse. And watch this, I'm gonna press Shift Z to enter the rendered mode, and right out of the box, it should look much better. Now we can start scaling the UV islands, moving it around, and just notice the displacement in real time. Though you have to refresh it, of course, by hitting tab 2 times. I would prefer not to do it. And you can select this other island of polygons, and the simple unwrap won't work. You'll have to first reset the UV maps. Press U, hit reset. Then it's just a matter of pressing follow active quads. And ta-da! You can move this strip of polygons like this, or rotate it by pressing R. Scale it down, align it with some element on the image. This technique opens up a whole range of creative possibilities for sci-fi stuff and for anything. And because we have this adaptive rendering or micropolygon rendering, we have this very optimized result where the number of polygons depend on the distance from the object and other sexy stuff. Let's just select a few random polygons like this, hit hue, reset it, or even move it like this if you have unwrapped it already. And this will create the area with the finer details. From here you can take this displacement as a base and continue working on the material. Let's go Shift F3 to enter the node editor, move these nodes over here, add the color ramp node, hook the depth map into it, and now let's hold Ctrl Shift and click on this node to preview it. Maybe let's squeeze the range to add the contrast. And this output should go into the color. Alright, now let's Ctrl Shift and click on the diffuse node and continue manipulating the color ramp to achieve the desired look. I don't even know what you desire, by the way. Feel free to drop me a line. Alright, and I selected the orangey color for the right flag. Just a little touch of cheerful colorization that is completely unrelated to the topic of this tutorial, of course. Okay, I added also the bump node. Let's connect it to the normal input of the diffuse BSDF. You can tweak the strength to really emphasize the contrast between two colors. And you know what, let's continue going off topic. Let's add the glossy node, just to make it a little bit prettier. But firstly, let's add the mix shader. And now press Shift A, go glossy BSDF, and connect it to the second socket. Now we need to add the Fresnel node to make it look like a plastic. Drag it into the factor. And also connect the normal output over here. And this should go into the glossy normals as well. And now we have something spectacular. The spectacular torus from outer space, designed by aliens. Have you watched the Prometheus or Aliens? I bet you have. That is definitely something that could be engineered by alien civilization. Maybe it is a biological weapon of mass destruction, but it looks really gorgeous. So who cares? Just continue watching for the more disturbing stuff. Okay, point number 5b. What if I want to edit the displacement map? Of course, you can edit it in the image editing software like GIMP, but let's try the other way. So we have here the plane. Surprise, so many planes! So let's quickly set up this plane for the displacement. I added the subsurf modifier, set it to the simple mode to not smooth it out. By the way, we're going to use the classic displacement modifier instead of the micropolygon displacement. So let's also add the subdivision surface once again and set the subdivisions to 3, for example. Or we can go even higher, but I think that 263,000 vertices will be more than enough. Next, I'm going to add the displace modifier. Click on this new button to assign a new texture to the displacement effect. Let's call it displacement. Set the texture coordinates to UV. And now click this button. Now let's click open and select this texture that you want to modify. As I've said, of course, you can do it in 2D, but in 3D you will be able to see the actual depth. So we've chosen this lunar bump texture. Now we need to decrease the strength of the displacement because obviously that's too much. That's completely over the top. And that looks better. Now we can press N to open the right tool shelf and turn on the ambient occlusion, because it really helps to preview the geometry, especially if you're using the matcap, as I do. You can even try to increase the strength of the ambient occlusion, but I'll leave it at 1. Now press Alt-C and select Mesh from Curve, Metasurf, Text, whatever, and that will collapse the modifier stack and basically convert everything to mesh. Now let's enter the Sculpt mode. Press T to open the left tool shelf. Let's select any brush you want. For example, the crease brush, because why not? We're simply demonstrating how it works. We don't need to keep it fancy. Or let's select the clay strips and try laying a few brush strokes here and there. If you had a hard day and feel depressed, you can draw something like a smiley face. That will hopefully cheer you up and you will be able to continue going through this tutorial, because I know how hard it is. And with smiley face, it's much better. Now, after we did it, let's jump to the object mode once again. We already have our camera set up, so let's come over to the render tab and hit render. Wait for a while and you'll get this depth map. Just don't forget to save it. The original texture was 16-bit TIFF, so I'm gonna save it as TIFF. That's a no-brainer. Just pick the same name, add the enhanced suffix, select the format. Usually I prefer the uncompressed files to not lose any valuable depth information, but you can as well choose the deflate or whatever compression algorithm and hit save as image. Voila, we made changes to the depth map, hooray! And what if I want to make this texture seamless? For that task, I would recommend using the image editor. So I launched Krita, and now I'm gonna go to the view menu and enable wrap around. That function repeats the image horizontally, vertically, and in every direction. Now we have to click this button and select this clone brush. What we need to do now is copy the parts of the image to hide the seam. So I enlarged the brush size by using brackets, left and right, and now I'm gonna hit Ctrl to sample the area that I want to clone. And then it's a matter of clicking and dragging across the seam, nothing special. But the fall off of the brush is kind of sharp, so I'm gonna click this button again and select the soft fall off in the mask type drop-down menu. Now click on this curve to create a more gradual transition. And after that, we should be good to go. See, this is much softer. And this will allow us to eradicate the seam so nobody will notice it. And that obviously means that we will be able to repeat, to tile the texture across the model. And after the displacement, there won't be abrupt changes in geometry. Now let's click Export, select the TIFF format. And now we just have to click Save and maybe add something meaningful to the name of the file, like Super Enhanced. Yeah, that will do the job. Okay, fine, let's return to Blender now and test the whole thing using the displacements, because I'm curious to know how the seamless texture will behave in a real-life situation. So let's create image texture, plug it into the displacement socket, but first let's select the Super Enhanced TIFF. So this should go here, and don't forget the subsurface modifier with the adaptive checkbox enabled. And in the material settings, this true checkbox as well. As for the geometry tab and render settings, I have the subdivision rate for the preview set to 3 pixels. Now I'm going to refresh the displacement view and maybe lower the subdivision rate. That looks okay. Let's test the tiling. I'm going to add the vector mapping node and also the texture coordinate node. Probably the simplest way to test the tiling would be to scale up the texture. I'm gonna click and drag on the scale and see what happens. But first, obviously, we need to refresh the view. Okay, that looks not so good, but the tiling actually looks okay. We just have to maybe lower the intensity of the displacement. We can do it using the math node, as we did previously. I'm gonna set it to multiply. I said to multiply. And put the 0.5 in the value. Well, that looks more appropriate for that scale. Right, so that's how we can make the texture seamless. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And after we have made this texture, we can start approaching different planets, like exoplanets, like Moon. Basically, that's what we did in the first part of this tutorial with this super cool planet. And we will abuse this technique even further in the upcoming tutorial, but for now, let's take a look at the image-based displacement. Create this Prometheus-looking stuff that may come in handy in your space trips. So let's get started with launching Krita, and we have this kind of a dragon texture here that I found on Pixabay. Let's duplicate this layer by right-clicking on the layer and pressing duplicate. I'm gonna go to filters, adjust, desaturate. We're gonna make a depth map out of this image. So click OK, and what we need to do is first, of course, rename this layer to something like displacement. Now let's go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We have to blur this image a bit because the displacement will be too sharp otherwise. So I'm gonna set the blur value to something like 70. Press OK. What I want to do next is press this button and create the new filter layer. The point is to squash the highlights as well as the shadows. to create more kind of predictable and flat displacement. If it makes sense, it will make sense when you see it. So let's click and drag on these flags to position it like this. And also let's clamp the lightness by clicking and dragging this flag. What I want to do is kind of work in the middle gray zone to avoid the extremes. So let's also wash out the dark tones. That looks good, let's press OK, and you can preview the effect by clicking on this eye icon. This will be our first depth map for the displacement. Let's export it. File, export, pattern displacement, hit save, and select the PNG format. Yeah, I don't follow my own recommendations to use 32-bit EXR. Let's try PNG this time. Now I went back to Blender, and in the node editor, I'm going to insert the image texture. Select this pattern displacement. But first, no, let's select pattern color, because we still need the diffuse color. To be able to preview it, switch to the texture mode, and make sure you have unwrapped the object. Okay, I'm going to connect the color output to the color input of the diffuse shader. Press Shift Z to enable Cycle's real-time viewport. And you see the plane is flat. Shouldn't be much of a surprise, because it's a plane. Now let's take a look at what happens if we just connect this image texture to the displacement. And I created this additional point by holding Shift and dragging across the line. So if we now refresh the plane by hitting Tab 2 times, we'll notice that it looks like total rubbish. And if we apply the math node after the image texture and multiply it by 2, for example, it will look even more rubbish. Actually, it will look twice more rubbish, like a double rubbish. That's precisely why we had to tweak the texture in Krita to blur it out a bit. The point was to avoid this jagged look of the displacement, to make it more controllable. So now I'm pressing Shift D to duplicate this image texture. And instead of the diffuse color, I'm going to select this processed version. I called it Pattern Displacement A. But first I'm going to hold Control and drag across this line to remove the connection. And after that I'm going to connect this new image texture to the second socket of the math node. Now that kind of displacement looks a lot better. Let's make it a bit stronger. Set the value of the multiply node to 5. Hit Tab twice. And I bet you can notice the artifacts caused by 8-bit PNG. So that's precisely what happens if you use 8-bit stuff. Never do it. Never ever do it. But in this case, it won't matter much at the end. Alright, what I'm going to do next is duplicate this texture once again by pressing Shift D and select yet another displacement map, which is called Pattern Displacement B. It's the same version as the Pattern Displacement A, but a little bit less blurry. It contains more kind of a medium level details. So I'm going to duplicate the math node, set the value to 2. Let's test this displacement map by plugging it into the displacement. This texture has a more medium scale details to it. Looks a little bit messy, so let's add the mixed RGB node and mix these two nodes together. So this goes into the first socket and this into the second. Now we can set it to add, and the rest basically is a matter of personal preference. You can tweak it based on the camera angle and whatever. I think I will keep the medium details at bay, so I'll set it to something like 0.4 or 0.42. That looks great. Let's reconnect the color. So we have displaced the plane, but one more crucial step to make it look believable is to add the bump map on top of our large scale displacement and all that stuff. And this hierarchy of details bump map allows us to create the finer details. So I'm going to hook up the color into the height, and the normal goes here. And bam, it's a huge difference. So although this tutorial is all about a micropolygon displacement, without the finer details created by the bump map, it often looks kind of bland. And with both displacement and bump map, you can storm the galleries like no problem. Or at least enjoy the process of displacing stuff, because it's always very enjoyable. After all, that's a very quick way to generate elaborate geometry like this. I think we can add a xenomorph crawling towards the camera. That would be scary as hell. Now let's talk about animated displacement anyway. That's another cool thing that we can do with adaptive displacement. So here I have the environment texture, HDRI, By the way, this one is made by Greg, thanks again. And also we have this black cube. Yes, it's a subdivided cube. Because as a quick reminder, a subdivided cube has much better topology for displacement. It is just a black diffuse material mixed with a glossy material. Alright, the subdivision rate is set to 6 for render and for the preview as well. That is not the highest quality, of course, but it will be sufficient for our purposes. The displacement is set to true. We also have the subdivision modifier with adaptive checkbox enabled. And now we can start the ball rolling. Let's add the noise texture. What I want to do is animate this procedural noise to drive the displacement. We don't need many details here. I want to simulate something like a droplet in space. Let's also add the math node to be able to multiply it by some number to make it stronger, displacement. Let's try 5. That looks nice. And also let's add the mapping node as well as the texture coordinate node. We needed to animate the offset of the noise, the X location, for example. Let's connect the generated output over here. And this should go into the vector slot. Now we can click and drag the location and see how it changes. Once again, to refresh it in the viewport, we have to hover the mouse over the viewport and press tab 2 times while selecting the object, because it will go into the edit mode and back to the object mode. Now I'm going to right click on the location and select insert keyframes. That will create the keyframe at frame number 1. And now I'll switch to frame number 190. Click and drag this down and then drag it right to change the values and insert yet another keyframe. Now what we can do is render a quick preview of the animation. Let's click on this button, select the output folder, call the file somehow morphine liquid from space. I think will be sufficient. This naming system for the files is unbeatable. You can feel the vastness of space just by looking at these file names. Okay, so I render it out, and this is how it looks. By the way, I used the 50% of the final resolution. That looks nice, but it's a little bit too quick for my taste. Let's go back to frame 190 and replace these keyframes with 2 instead of 5. And of course, we can make this displacement animation more complex by adding the Voronoi texture, for example, and mixing it with this noise texture. I'm gonna press Shift A, select color, mix RGB. And this node goes over there. Just for a second, I'm gonna set the mix factor to 1 to just preview this Voronoi noise. And right out of the box, it looks nice. Let's set it to 0.3. Or let's return it to 0 for a moment. Scrub to frame 80, for example, and set the keyframe. This will be the start of this effect of morphing to Voronoi noise. And let's scrub to another frame, 120, for example, and insert a new keyframe with value 0.85. That will be the strongest morphing point of the effect. And let's now set it back to 0 on the frame 165. Now we can scrub through the frames and hit tab to preview these points. I think that should look alright, and I'm about to render a new preview animation. So before I hit the animation button, let's check the resolution and other stuff. So the render samples are set to 30 and the resolution is 25% of 1912 by 1080 pixels. See, it renders blazing fast. And I'll just pause the video for a second and render it out and show you. So behold, advanced micro displacement morphing liquid from space. Now that will be a cool name for an animation file. So with the micropolygon rendering, we can achieve this kind of effects. I hope you liked this tutorial. Once again, first we baked a depth map. Then we took a brief look at how we can edit this depth map in 3D, then rebake it, and we also made the texture seamless. Then we sculpted the doodle art using the displacement. This was our next step, the Prometheus-looking image-based displacement, which you can use to scare the hell out of people. And lastly, we created this animated goo using procedural noises. You have just watched the displacement tutorial from the Space VFX Element series by Aidy, Burrows and me, Gleb Alexandrov. In the next tutorial from this free update to the Space VFX Element series, we'll put this knowledge into practice and create this exoplanet. If you have enjoyed this free bonus chapter, why not take a look at the full Space VFX course? Unless we have it already, in which case you'll have seen this first and also have access to the project files.